Hello and welcome to the live stream, wherever you are in the world, whatever time zone you're in. Welcome to our live stream with your questions coming in via YouTube chat. We're at the back end of the August break, and that means the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort. Very sadly, that'll be the last time I'll be able to say that, because this is the last appearance of Formula One at the revamped Zandvoort circuit in Holland. Beautiful racetrack right by the sea. And I imagine it's going to be beautiful there this weekend, that's for sure. And all the Dutch fans will be there in support of, guess who? Max Verstappen, who might have a half reasonable chance. We'll be talking in a second with Mark Slade about the prospects for the Dutch Grand Prix. Might have a half reasonable chance this weekend, who knows, with Red Bull. Anyway, Zandvoort means a lot to me because in 1967, when I was but a kid, I was lucky enough to come over to England with my dad and mum, my dad was on leave, worked for a British company in Australia, and part of the deal was that he was able to go back every 4 years on a brief holiday. I went back and took a couple of weeks off school as well, and in that trip went to the Monaco Grand Prix, the Alton Park Formula One race, the charity meeting in April, and went to a few of the circuits around England and just did as much motor. I went to Duns actually, look at Jim Clark's house from the outside in '67. Anyway, at the back end of that holiday, I spent a week with a family in Amsterdam, just as you do these exchange things, and just staying with that family, getting to see what Holland was all about, and that was great. And then I was due to fly back to Australia on my own, and I was only I was 13, I think 12, 13, and I took a 707 from Amsterdam Schiphol to Sydney, KLM. And as we took off, this is the punchline. As we took off, I looked out the window and there was Zandvoort below me. I couldn't believe it. I took a picture of it. And I just thought, wow, that's meant to be, isn't it? And yeah, Zandvoort, so many things, so many historic events at Zandvoort over the years, tragic and otherwise. And so this circuit, we need to appreciate it for what it is, what it was, as much as what it is this weekend. Anyway, without any more ado, to take us into our discussion, I'm going to chat with him first about the Dutch Grand Prix Zandvoort, and don't forget, it's a sprint race as well. Welcome to Mark Slade.
Hello,
Mark,
Peter. How
yeah,
you
good
doing?
to see you. Good to see you, looking fit and well during the
Thank you.
August break, or at the end of the
You too.
August break. What have you been up to? I mean,
Not.
a lot of drivers have been to exotic islands and going various places they've always wanted to visit. What have you been doing?
I've visited the odd coffee shop in the Cotswolds. I've been up a ladder doing some decorating, some fairly basic stuff, but it's
Brilliant,
been good. It's been nice.
brilliant. So, Dutch Grand Prix this weekend, Zandvoort. What does that mean for you?
Well, funnily enough, it's not a track I visited very much because I never went to the old circuit. I think the last race was it '82 on the old circuit, and then Formula One didn't come back until I'm trying to remember now. Was it 23, 22? I visited with Haas. Well, it must have been 23 that I visited with Haas for the first time. So that was a new experience. Quite a strange paddock layout, very cramped, and it's such a different environment than most modern circuits. Being on the seafront, and you literally park just off the boulevard on the beach, and walk down with the fans under the grandstand into this sort of small cramped paddock, and then all the motorhomes are off in another area because there's not enough space for them in all to have it all together. A bit like Spa in that sense. The circuit's a really tricky one. Lots of sort of a mixture of low and medium speed corners. It's quite difficult to get a good balance because of the normal problems with entry stability and mid-quarter understeer. And then you've got the wind coming off the sea normally, which does have quite a big effect, some corners in particular. And then for me, the other thing that was interesting was that banked, was it turn 3? Seeing that for real, I thought that's quite a strange corner, quite unusual for the drivers, having to sort of take that high line. But you actually come in, it's quite a difficult entry to that corner because you come out the hairpin, and there's a little bit of a wiggle that you have to get just right to get the right entry. And I think the year before in 22, Kev had a 22 or 23, Kev had quite a big accident there when he got that that little wiggle wrong, and that sent him off. So quite a tricky little circuit. I must say, I wish I'd experienced the full size circuit, because that was just majestic. Used to have some great races there, didn't they? Because you'd have such a long lead up to the hairpin, so perfect for overtaking. Whereas nowadays, overtaking is pretty tricky because there aren't any really sensibly long straights there anymore.
Yeah,
But it's good
just at the
experience.
intro to the show, I've got a little bit of AP archive footage there of the 76 Dutch Grand Prix, which James Hunt won memorably from McLaren, both hands in the air as he crosses the line. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That was that long straight. And but even then, back then, even back into the long before that, Zandvoort was known as a circuit of very difficult to overtake. The only place really was the end of that long straight, and there was a lot of overtaking, as you say. And I think one of the other plus points for that was that the entry into the Tarzan hairpin was very wide. I think it still is relatively wide, sort of Austin spec wide entry. So that's to encourage overtaking as well. But it's a very, very short lap now. And I'm just wondering, from an engineer's perspective, what's it like when it is a short lap like that? Apart from, blink and you miss it in terms of lap scoring and everything else. But in terms of getting information from the car, is that an advantage or a disadvantage?
It's good being able to do lots of laps in practice, but so you get good information from doing more laps. But the big disadvantage is just the management of the car on the track when you're dealing with, when you're doing your slow laps, dealing with all the people coming up behind you, and then in the race, particularly when you're trying to get information from the driver and trying to give him information, it's just very difficult to find an appropriate place to do it. Austria is a very short lap, but at least it's got sort of 3 longish straights, so you actually get quite good opportunity to talk to the driver there. Whereas Zandvoort, it's more like Monaco in the sense that it's almost relentless in terms of the drivers are pretty much always doing something. So it is a very tricky one for that.
So just to interject there, it's probably a very good track for Oscar Piastri in that case, in the sense of don't talk to me right now. So he's not going to miss too much. And on the other side of the coin, the discussions between Lewis and his team on the pit wall will go out the window, won't they? Because he'll ask a question, and what, 4 or 5 laps will have taken place before they get back to him.
It certainly is a track where you need to be very sharp, otherwise you can easily miss something, and as you say, you're into another lap and the damage is done. So yeah, it's a treat. It's good fun. It's a good circuit, and obviously with Amsterdam nearby, it's a nice environment. The fans are unbelievable. It's probably the closest in Europe that you get to have Brazilian fans in terms of the energy. And I would say one of the downsides when you're working in the office between sessions is the noise. There's always thumping music and lots of loud cheering. So I bet you can't, for atmosphere, it's fabulous.
Yeah, and it's such a shame, isn't it, when you talk about the enthusiasm of the Dutch crowd, obviously behind Max, but nonetheless, the enthusiasm of the Dutch crowd and that lovely circuit, the seaside atmosphere. And you look also at not having a French Grand Prix, not having a German Grand Prix, and you wonder again about the direction in which we're going with Formula One. Because if there are 3 passionate countries that should have a Formula One race, it should be France, Germany, and Holland, you could argue. And yet, here we go on the slippery slope the other way.
Yeah, it's soul versus money, isn't it?
Yeah.
And money normally wins in those competitions.
Yeah, very sad.
But we shall see. I mean, the movement to the money-making circuits hasn't gone too brilliantly over the last few years, has it? With various things going on in the world. So maybe at some point they need to take stock and say, well, we need a core of reliable circuits, and those are more likely to be in Europe, I would say. So we shall see.
Mark, neither of us, I think I can speak for you, are fans of the sprint race format, but this is a sprint. It's almost as if, well, it's your last race. We'll give you the honor of having a sprint weekend. Yeah, thanks. But I don't know. A little voice inside my head says maybe the sprint race on a circuit like Zandvoort might actually work. Maybe not. I don't know.
I don't know. The basic problem with the sprints is that because there's no scheduled pit stops, there's no option for strategy. they just tend to settle down quite quickly. And the drivers are obviously not quite as aggressive as maybe they would be in the race, because they know they've got qualifying in the afternoon. So it can make for a slightly tame affair. On the other hand, I think the fact that it is a short circuit and so it's busy, that's a benefit. That does help that format somewhat, because it means that there's more interest in that side of things. So you just take it as it comes. But I think I explained before why I don't particularly enjoy the sprint formats, and it largely comes down to those two things I've already said, that they tend to be a bit tame. And so it surprises me that the authorities think that that's a good way of improving revenues, but apparently it's because the circuits find it easier to get punters in on the Saturday and even on the Friday. But I would have thought we could do other things that would be just as successful. And I thought we now sold out every race anyway, according to all the numbers. So I'm not sure why that should be such a big issue, but apparently it is.
Yeah, and bear in mind that, I mean, if it's for the circuit organizers, bear in mind that the only revenue the promoters get is from the gate. They don't get any other revenue. But that is such an insignificant number relative to the cost of the Grand Prix itself and all the other revenues that are coming in. You wonder that, I mean, Bernie never cared about that. He never cared about the gate at all, the number of spectators at the racetrack. And I think Liberty have the view that the more spectators are there, the better the atmosphere, the better the potential for growth, et cetera, which is fine. But the bottom line is, should we be changing our way of thinking about the races formats purely because of this, this thing about the gate? And whether or not, I suppose the other interesting fact would be whether or not the television viewing figures are going up because of the sprint or not. And we don't really, I mean, mixing that with qualifying, quite difficult to do. Let me just put something up on screen, Mark. You know all this already, but I think it's always a nice thing that Pirelli put out, which is to show where we've come from with tires this year, compounds they've selected, and where we're going in the relevant weekend. For the Dutch Grand Prix in the Netherlands, they're not the hardest, they're not the softest, they're right there in the middle as used at Spa. No surprise there, but I guess that means we're looking at potentially a two-stop race.
Possibly. I don't know. The tyres, to be honest, have been getting better and better in terms of their graining resistance, which has been the main reason why you've been forced into two stops before. And since they haven't gone for the softest tyres in terms of C3, C4, C5, it still opens the risk of them finding that actually the C4 works really well and it becomes a one-stop. It's a shame to me that we can't have a softer and a harder tire, say just a C5 and a C3 or even a C2, and just have two tires, because I think that would be more likely to give more pit stops in a race. So we'll just have to see. I mean, the teams will be very pragmatic about it. And it'll just come down to whether the C2 performs well or not. If they think the C2 is off the pace, then they'll be looking at C3 and C4, and that might make it more likely to be two stops. But alternatively, if the C4 just gives up very badly, and I'm wrong about the graining, then that might become a problematical tire, and then it becomes a one stop with just C3 and C2. But those are the sorts of decisions I'll be looking at. One of the issues they'll have is obviously because they've only got one practice session, then they'll have less information going into the actual race, into the sprint race. But then the sprint race will give them a lot of info about what to do for the main event. So it's pros and cons in that sense. But it makes the choice for the sprint race maybe a little more tricky. If someone's done looking good after sprint qualifying, unusually good, then they'll be more tempted to run new tyres in the sprint to try and maximise their result there. And that could affect what happens for the race. But overall, I suspect that inevitably some teams will be hoping that they can string it out to a one-stop, and then it just comes down to, in the first part of the race, if the tyres are performing better than expected, then who's going to make the decision to switch in that first stint?
Yeah, and then of course there's the safety car intervention factor, which is always
Yeah.
to be considered at Zandvoort. I guess the question on many people's lips will be, given that it's a sprint race, given that it's a short lap, given the whole thing's a bit scrappy with variables and the wind and the sand, you can imagine Max actually having a reasonable weekend, right, at Zandvoort? I can
Uh,
anyway.
I think it will suit him. I'm sure he's determined to put on a good show, but then he always does, he does always set out to put on a good show. The lack of very high speed corners, I think, helps the Red Bull, and potentially isn't quite so good for the Ferrari, which has always performed very well in the combination of low speed and very high speed. Medium speed, the Ferrari struggled a little bit more. Whereas the McLaren and the Mercedes are good in the medium speed corners, and that's actually the corners that define whether you're competitive in Zandvoort or not. It's those medium speed corners that tend to, if you're losing time on them, particularly the sort of there's a right left sequence that leads onto that short straight on the infield. Those are critical corners for lap time, and a car that works well in the medium speed, has good strong front end, will be quick. So we'll see. If he's got the same problems with ride and shifting and the braking that he normally complains about, then that might make it difficult, because the curbs have some influence on the corners, particularly on the exit curbs. If your traction's poor coming off those and he's not happy with the ride, he might be struggling. But yeah, we'll see. He normally goes well there. I'm just interested to see how the Ferraris are. Are they better in those medium speed corners than they have been? And then the big question for me is the Aston Martin with the engine upgrade that they should have for this event. And it'll be really interesting to see if they can build on the progress that they obviously made in Hungary with the chassis upgrades. And that they may have some more chassis upgrades, I'm not sure, but if they do, then I'm really interested to see whether Fernando can stick it into Q2, or maybe even start to think about Q3.
Yeah, that'll be fascinating to see. Just going back to Max, we left Max in Hungary, and you very interestingly talking about a potential damper overheating problem, and it's something that had plagued the team, it appears, for quite a long time now.
Yeah.
Which lends itself to what you're talking about, the use of the curbs in the middle section there. But given the August break, I mean, what actually happens in the August break, assuming Red Bull are going to say, right, we've really got to focus on damping, cooling, or whatever they're going to do, could they have done anything at all during the August break? And will the car be any different here compared with Hungary in the time that they've had or not had?
Well, the August break is quite interesting, because the factories do literally shut down, and no work is allowed to be done at all, other than on the buildings themselves. Sometimes you have some renovation work goes on in the factory. The travel people can still work, but basically any developments have to be underway before the break, and there won't be any. Some outside suppliers might be working on parts, but there won't be anything actually happening in the team's factories themselves. So basically anything that new for this race would have had to have been put into place before the August break, and there won't be anything that's being done. There won't be any projects started in the factories during that time. So there won't be anything new coming out of what happened in Hungary, for instance. But given that this seems to be a problem that they've encountered previously, potentially, then you'd hope that they had some work ongoing, and maybe we'll see the fruits of it in this event. But it was a really interesting thing to be part of, because when it was introduced, it was a real breath of fresh air, because you literally, you're not getting emails from anybody, because no one's allowed to send emails. It's a proper shutdown, and it means that everyone just can take a complete break and not think about it until they came back on, presumably on Sunday night. It all kicks off again on Monday, and then it's frantic. So it's literally like you hit the pause button, and all the work that you would have done sort of in the second week after the previous Grand Prix, that's what started on Monday. So yeah, it is a proper break, and nothing new will have been done in that time.
So Red Bull might still have a damper problem at the Dutch Grand Prix, I think. We have to
They
assume.
could do,
Yeah. Right, let's get on with some, if you're okay with this, Mark, I hope you can stay around with a little bit. We'll get on with some questions from our viewers on YouTube chat. And if you haven't joined us before, YouTube chat is available just below this video as it is live at present. So please join with any questions or comments that you like. The first is from Jim Honts, 7313, one of our channel members. Thank you so much for your support, Jim. Hi, Peter. I think that George Russell is having a difficult time adapting to the 26 cars because of their overall reduction of grip under the new spec. The cars are no longer glued to the track as they were. I'm wondering if you've got a reaction to that one, Mark.
I'm not sure. You might have a better idea of why George might be affected by a reduction in grip and an increase in power in terms of his driving style. But for me, that's the essential difference. The cars have got a much more sensitive throttle and less grip, and I suspect probably a bit more mid-corner understeer than they had previously. But then from what I saw of George's driving style previously, I thought he was one of the smoother drivers. And so I'm a little bit surprised that it is causing a problem for him. And I to be honest, I suspect it's not so much as it's causing him a problem. It's just that Kimi's doing an even better job than he was doing it in the car, and is better tuned into this type of car and its low grip, and maybe has even more sensitivity and a more precise positioning of the car. Because as I say, I don't think, to me, the car spec doesn't seem to be necessarily something that would cause George's style a big issue. I don't know if you've got anything that you can add to that based on your analysis of
Yeah,
drivers.
I would say exactly what I would agree with exactly what you've just said, Mark. I think George is actually driving the car as George drives it, and driving it pretty well. It's just that he's got this guy Kimi in the other car, who's, because there's more understeer, he's slightly more supple and subtle throttle modulations and steering inputs, none of which are visible on the telemetry, are giving him an advantage. And it's almost a double whammy, because it's giving him an advantage of stability, where he's able to do more when he needs to in terms of power generation. And it's also giving an advantage on time management. And he's got all the benefits of being able to manage the variables incredibly well, because he's got a lovely sweet spot in which he's operating. Whereas George, his inputs have always been relatively spiky. They were relatively spiky even to Lewis, and they're definitely relatively spiky compared with Kimi. And I think that's where George is struggling, because there is less grip. And when you have a slightly more spiky steering input or throttle application or brake decrease, all those things are going to be magnified by the lack of grip. And if you've got more grip, you can get away with it. I think that's what's going on. And the only solution for George really is to start driving as Kimi does. And that's virtually impossible for him to do from a career existential perspective, let alone in the middle of the year. All he can do is carry on being George Russell, and he will win more races this year for sure. But in terms of beating Kimi, equal car, equal set of tires, it's going to be tough for him for sure.
Yeah, I think the point you made about the power generation is actually one I hadn't mentioned, and that does seem to be important, because a lot of the time that George has been losing seems to be because Kimi is effectively creating or able to use less energy where it's inefficient, and has more energy, electrical energy available when he needs it. So how much of that is due to problems that George has been having with his car is difficult to say, because we don't have enough information on that. Certainly at Spa, even in qualifying, it looked like George's car was underperforming. But it does seem that Kimi is able to, with his driving style, recover and deploy energy more effectively than George is doing. And I guess, given how important the acceleration of these cars is, then that does get magnified. And then if George is struggling to get the car into the corners, he'll be struggling to get on the throttle as early as Kimi. And again, that will be where the lap time is coming from. So I think it's down to some very, very subtle little things. And it just kind of reminded me a little bit of Kimi Räikkönen in his time with the 2005 car in particular, because when you had a tyre that you had to use for the whole race, it came down to an efficiency of driving style. And Kimi was always able to make the tyres last longer than other people because he was much less demanding on them. When you had to be more aggressive with the car, and particularly because of the tyres, and this became a feature in 2006 when Michelin made the tyres more temperature resistant. So to get them working, you had to work them harder. Kimi's style didn't really suit that, and I think that's one of the reasons why Fernando was so strong in 06, because he could do that. So I think we might be seeing some similarities with that, and there's no doubt with the Pirelli tyres, and this has been true for a long time, but I think it might be where Kimi does have a strength, is they are incredibly surface temperature sensitive. So any little sliding at all causes localized heating of the surface, which reduces your grip. So anything that you can do to keep that surface temperature down, and that basically comes through reducing sliding, be that braking, acceleration, or laterally, you will have better grip for longer. And it seems to me that Kimi has an ability in that area that even George doesn't. It's a strength that Max has had in the past, and I think it's actually potentially a little bit of a weakness for Lewis. He likes to sort of use the throttle, doesn't he, to dance the car around a little bit, and these tyres don't really suit that. So I think that's one of the reasons why sometimes you see Lewis looking good initially, and then his tyres seem to go off a little bit more quickly than maybe Kimi's or even
Charles.
like Charles, yeah, to some extent. But it very much depends on the situation. In Barcelona, the move to the softer tyre seemed to work for Lewis, because in actual fact, sometimes with the softer tyre, because that tyre has more grip, you actually have less movement and less sliding. And so sometimes a softer tyre actually can work well for you. It's not always obvious how it's going to work, and that's why the team sometimes get confused, to be honest, because it isn't always the case that a harder tyre lasts longer. It normally is, but it isn't always the case. So yeah,
One
it's
of the
interesting.
teammates that Kimi always looked good against in terms of time management that Mark was just referring to was Juan Pablo Montoya when they were at McLaren. And here I just wanted to give a big shout out to Juan Pablo, actually, because as you may know, there have been horrendous earthquakes in Colombia recently, particularly in the region of Cali, where my wife was born and raised. And she was telling me yesterday or 2 days ago that there's been an unbelievable reaction in Colombia to Juan Pablo staging an amazing charity event for victims of the earthquake. And so well done, Juan Pablo, brilliant. He got a
Yeah,
lot of friends and colleagues from all over the world in other sports to take part. There was karting, there was all sorts of things, demos. And I think it kind of put the new president of Colombia into the shade, because he turned up and his basic token gesture was to give balloons to some of the kids standing around in the street, which didn't go down particularly well. So Juan Pablo, I think you definitely won that one. Brilliant. Good
yeah,
stuff.
good for him.
So yeah, next one is from Peter Nikolov, 688. Another member. Thank you so much, Peter. 8020. What ensures that on energy poor tracks, there'll be enough energy to recover by braking in the absence of an MGU-H? It's a good question, and we didn't talk about that really, Mark, but I'm guessing that Zandvoort is relatively energy rich, correct?
Yeah, because there's not a huge amount of full throttle time, which is what it comes down to. I mean, effectively, this question just hits the nail on the head. You can't guarantee there'll be enough energy, which is why they impose limits. And basically, the teams have to decide where to use the energy they have in the most efficient manner. And that's why we see tracks like Silverstone, Suzuka, and we will see at Monza that there isn't enough energy available, and it will be very problematical. Oops, sorry, I'm messing around my screen.
You're okay. You're okay.
So Yeah. So that is essentially the problem. It's management of that meager amount of energy on circuits that have lots of full throttle time that is the reason for all the sort of behaviour that you don't like to see, the lifting, coasting, the super clipping, and all that stuff. So that is the bottom line. It is what decides how the races are run and how the drivers have to drive.
But the FIA have realised that, and they're going to make drastic changes for next year and year after, Mark. Yeah,
No.
yeah, right.
You got to remember that it actually doesn't matter how you drive the car. No one's interested.
Yeah.
We've been told.
Yeah, well, we're going back to 60/40 by 2020. I don't know what, 28 or something, and that's
Yes,
nothing like enough.
it's not right.
And that's
It's still not good enough.
if you want a T-shirt to tell the world that that's not enough, go to my merchant. I'll put up the QR codes at the end of the live stream. But we're doing T-shirts now which say basically, 60/40 is not enough. Make corners great again. Make engines great again. Yeah, well. We do our best. That's all I can say. It's a heavy, steep mountain we have to climb. Again from Peter, if we go back to a 2 megajoule recharge and a 4 megajoule deployment, how will the lack of direct energy transfer from the MGU-H to the MGU-K affect each lap?
Well,
I'll leave that
the
one to you,
numbers.
Mark, I think.
Yeah, the basic thing is that the MGU-H was a good way of recovering energy. Admittedly, at the time we had the MGU-H, you didn't have to recover as much because there was less available to discharge. But fundamentally, if the cars had MGU-Hs now, then you would see less of an issue because they would be able to recover more energy during the lap. And so they would be able to, the drivers would be able to deploy more energy, and you would effectively have less obvious super clipping and lift and coasting going on, because the MGU-H was very efficient. And now basically what they're having to deal with is more inefficient recovery of energy to deploy, and they've got more powerful MGU-K, so it eats up the energy more quickly. And that it comes back to that is the fundamental problem. So because the cars don't store very much energy on board, they have to do a lot of recovery, and getting rid of the MGU-H meant that there's just less opportunity to recover energy. And the MGU-K, which also generates energy as well as deploys it, it is a more powerful MGU-K than they had before. So when it's working, it is generating more energy. But it's the fact that you can only use the MGU-K to recover energy when the car's slowing down. That means they have to do more slowing down, basically, to recover that energy. And so you have a bigger swing.
Can you just remind everyone why we don't have MGU-H on the cars?
Leading question there, Peter. So basically, the MGU-H was a very complex piece of kit, and Mercedes and Ferrari, and to a lesser extent Renault, and Honda had obviously gained a lot of experience with that unit over time. And when it was decided that Formula One needed new engine manufacturers, the main one being the VW Audi group with their Audi engine, they said that they didn't want to come in unless the MGU-H was basically deleted, because they felt they were at a massive disadvantage to those other teams. And they would have been. It's as simple as that. They would have been at a massive disadvantage, because when the teams first had to use hybrid engines back in 2014, it was the use of the MGU-H that was the biggest differentiator between the teams, and the thing that Renault and Honda in particular struggled with, and that Mercedes did a particularly good job of. So Audi were right that it would have been a problem, but the fact is that we now have other problems because we got rid of it. So it's a question of, was it worth it? And I actually suspect that Audi would have come into Formula One even if they'd had to do an MGU-H. They were just playing the game, and I guess they won.
Well said, Mark, and thanks for that summary. A sad indictment, really, of everything that's been going on, I think. Final one from Peter. Does this mean that 1,000+ horsepower is a mirage on every lap?
Absolutely, it is.
Yeah.
Because when the engines don't have any electrical energy left, they're actually delivering just over 500 horsepower.
Which
So
we saw at Suzuka, right?
yeah, and in Spa, in Sector 2
Yeah.
at Spa, you basically had old Cosworth DFV levels of power output in the cars, which was why Fernando was saying, you know, the cook in the motorhome could drive these cars, which obviously isn't quite true, but as an exaggeration, it got the point home. You drive, there are circuits, particularly the ones with high percentage throttle, 100% throttle periods, that the drivers don't have any electrical energy, and then they're literally driving cars with 5 to 500 horsepower, 5 to 550 horsepower, which is not much different to a Cosworth powered car from the 70s and 80s. So that's reality, but with much more aerodynamic grip and probably better tires. So you get to the point where the grip of the car massively outweighs the power available, and then they become quite dull to drive in that sense.
Yeah, and if you look at the intro footage, the AP archive footage of that 76 Dutch Grand Prix, you can see there's very little of it, but I was actually lucky enough to see all the bits I was editing out. But you can see James Hunt in the McLaren M23 sliding beautifully with the Nicholson McLaren DFV engine, approximately around 500 horsepower probably, and of course it was the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort, just to sort of go full circle, in which that brilliant engine, the Cosworth DFV, made its debut. 67 Dutch Grand Prix, and Jim Clark won first time out with that. It was about 420 horsepower then, with the power coming in at an enormous bang at about, I think it's about 4.8, 5,000, somewhere like that. And Jimmy was a bit shocked at how lumpy the engine was, but they got on top of that, and obviously there are lots of developments, and still the most successful Formula One engine of all time, and we saw it for the first time at Zandvoort in the Dutch Grand Prix. So there's just one of the many milestones that we've seen on this great circuit. By the seaside, Hurricane Starley says, "Hi Peter, is the membership part of the channel live again? Only it's not showing on YouTube, and none of the past videos are available at present. We are doing a live stream on Sunday. Many thanks." Yeah, just to that's just a sort of behind the channel question, which I've put a short out about that and put something out on the community. We're just changing the way, the structure of our channel behind the scenes in terms of our commercial link with YouTube. And that takes about 3 weeks to do. And while that's going on, everything is paused basically, but it doesn't affect you, the viewer, in any way. And if we get to Sunday, when I always do the live race chat for members, and we haven't yet got everything perfectly set up with the new admin system, then what I'll be doing, and it's thank you for the question, because it's important to watch out for this. What I'll do is post in the community section of the channel for members only. I will post a link to the live chat that we're going to be doing. It'll be an unlisted link that be only there for members, channel members. So it'll be, from your point of view, providing you go to that link, everything will be seamless and be absolutely as normal, just hopefully as the videos are at the moment. But because membership involves a monthly payment, that has been paused because at the moment we're changing the flow of the money from one area to another. It's called AdSense, the company behind Google and YouTube. It's quite complicated, but it's quite efficient, and it's actually been a bit of a learning experience for me to go through all that. But thanks for raising that question. But I'll reminding everybody about that before we go to the live race chat as well. But everything else will be normal. And again, thanks everybody for their support and understanding in this slightly confusing period. Hurricane, again, also thanks for these streams to you both. I don't get to watch them live, but they're fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Hurricane. Good to know that. And of course, we are aware that many people do watch these streams retrospectively, perhaps even download them, just listen to the audio, which would have been a bit of a problem with the previous one where I was doing all those circuit drawings and stuff. But I have got that out as a podcast now, and I've put in a few diagrams into the podcast, into the chapter heading. So hopefully it's sort of half watchable in that sense. Sarosh, another great supporter. Thank you, Sarosh. Hi, Mark. What are the things that you and Mika found impressive about Michael during his Ferrari years and later when you were his engineer at Mercedes, Michael's engineer at Mercedes, that is?
Yeah, I think it was his relentlessness in terms of his work ethic. You notice that simple things like every single pit entry and exit that Michael did was practice for the race. I don't think he ever missed an opportunity to improve what he was doing. So, and I have to say, Mika's commitment to that sort of thing was not as strong, sadly.
I
Mika
wonder why
relied.
that. Wonder why that was, Mark.
It was quite hard work persuading Mika to practice pit entries and pit exits. A little bit similarly with Kimi. Kimi was better, but what was interesting with Mika is that even if he didn't practice them, come the race, he would normally do the best ones.
Interesting.
Which was infuriating, but thank goodness he did.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was just that was a difference in character. But I think it's just Michael's work ethic was the thing. He knew that he wasn't necessarily as fast as one or two other drivers, but he made up for that with his 100% commitment to what he did and the way he went about his work. And that was what was super impressive about him. And when I had the good fortune to work with him, I think it's fair to say that his ultimate pace had somewhat dropped off. Not least, I think, because of the motorcycle accident he had in the period between leaving Ferrari and coming back to Mercedes. And I think that posed some problems with his neck. But he still was super keen to understand everything that was going on. And he clearly could understand it. Again, I would say I hope nobody takes this the wrong way, but Mika's understanding of the car mechanically and aerodynamically wasn't super strong. He understood what he wanted and he could feel when things changed, but he didn't necessarily understand the sort of, mechanics or aerodynamics behind it. And that meant that I had to try and explain things or why we should do things, and I had to gain his trust. And he had a huge amount of trust in Adrian Newey as well, and that helped a lot because basically Adrian would listen to what Mika wanted, and then say, "Well, I think we should do this," and Mika would accept that because he knew that Adrian knew what he talked about, and I would hope to some extent also that I knew what I was talking about. Whereas with Michael, it was much more of a collaborative thing where you would discuss what the options were and what effects they would have, and he would understand that side of things and make a choice more based on his understanding of the sort of the actual what was actually going on. So I would say that was one of the things that was impressive about him, and that's true of many drivers. Some drivers just have a stronger sense of or understanding of the theory, and others rely more on other people to put what they need into practice. So that was one of the big differences, I would say.
And Mark, when you were with Mika in that era, and there was Michael at Ferrari with Ross Brawn and Jean Todt, and he was on Bridgestones and you were on Michelin's, I suppose the fundamental difference was that we were in that tire war period. And it was quite difficult to compare. Difficult to compare like with like, quite obviously, but also I would imagine a little bit irritating that Ferrari had such a close relationship with a tire company as impressive and productive
Yeah.
as Bridgestone, whereas you were Michelin, which was great tires, but you're having to sort of share it with a few other quick teams as well. So it wasn't quite the same.
So just to remind you, it was actually the first year in '98.
Well,
Ferrari
you were
won
on
Goodyear,
you brought
and we
Bridgestone
were
in,
on
yeah, but
we
then
were on Bridgestone, and then
Ron went
it
to
became
Michelin,
a
didn't
one
he?
tire thing after that. But it is true that one huge advantage that Ferrari had was the testing that they did. And obviously, when they had Goodyear, they did a huge amount of work with them, but they also did a huge amount of work testing with Bridgestone. And it felt to us, to be quite honest, that certainly after we'd won the championship in '98 and '99, I think Bridgestone actually wanted to win a championship with Ferrari, shall we say. That was the sort of feeling we got. Some of the decisions that were made about tyres and tyre choices felt that they were being driven from a different area a little bit, which made things a little tricky. But then I think that was a natural thing on Bridgestone's part, potentially because they were getting more information from Ferrari, because Ferrari were doing all that extra testing at Fiorano, which we just weren't able to do. And Michael was doing an awful lot of that testing. So he was smart enough to realize that the more work he did, the more it would be tuned into his needs. And he absolutely exploited that 100%.
Can I just interrupt there,
Yeah,
Mark? Because I remember distinctly having a conversation with Ron about this, and it backs up everything you're saying. But there's a further nuance, which is that there was a pivotal moment when basically Ross and Michael and Jean, I guess, said to Bridgestone, "You are brilliant. We can win a lot of championships with you. The way forward for now is to have a complete and utter freedom of exchange of information from Ferrari to Bridgestone and back again." And the thinking behind that was that would drive Ron away from Bridgestone, because he immediately thought then that some of McLaren's data would effectively find their way to Ferrari. And they knew that Ross and the team knew that would happen. And Ron reacted exactly as they predicted he would, which is say, well, in
yeah,
that case, I'm going to go to Michelin. That's what
yeah,
actually sparked it all. Does that
yeah,
make sense
yeah.
to you?
Absolutely, 100% it did. And but funnily enough, I think that actually worked in McLaren's favour, in that honestly, I think the Michelin tyres did end up being better tyres than Bridgestone, which I think we saw.
Back end of
Obviously,
the whole
not
thing.
not
Yeah.
in yeah not in 02, 03, 04. Ferrari still had the upper hand on the Bridgestones, but I have to say I think that was because their car was stronger for most of that period. Certainly, the 04 McLaren was a bit of a disaster. In 03, we managed to sort of screw ourselves over by developing the MP418, which wasn't very good, and effectively pulling development off the car, which was actually leading the championship until halfway through that year with Kimi. And the 2002 car, which became the 03, the 17D, the original version of that car wasn't quite up to scratch compared to the Ferrari. So, and I think we were in our learning phase of Michelin. So it wasn't clear cut, and I think McLaren ended up being better off getting away from Bridgestone. But I think part of it was that Ferrari did drive a wedge between McLaren and Bridgestone very effectively, and that's a classic case of Ross's and Jean Todt's political prowess, isn't it?
And
Which
then
they again they played
effectively
very well.
driving Michelin out of the sport by accusing them of flagrant cheating with the whole dual compound thing, which is why we don't
Yes,
have Michelin in the sport today, probably,
yes, yeah, yeah,
which was not very clever or
yeah,
pleasant, actually. I remember being at that press conference at Monza when Ferrari announced that, yeah, Ferrari announced that they felt Michelin were cheating.
yeah,
It was a huge thing.
yeah.
Right, Jim Honts again. Peter, do you have any inclinations to what Max will do for 27 and 28? Everyone seems to have an opinion. Well, yeah, they do, and we've been talking about this a lot. A lot of people had opinions about this 2 years ago, didn't they? They didn't even think he'd make it this far to at Red Bull, and he was always going to go to Mercedes or this or that. Um, we talk about it a lot. I mean, it depends on what's available and what is out there. And of course, it depends still on how Red Bull are going to go in the second half of this year. And if they have a half reasonable, half year and Max wins a race or two, then he may feel okay about staying there. If he has a terrible second half, I mean, what are the options for 27? I mean, still not much out there. The only thing probably that might happen is that he might go to McLaren maybe instead of Oscar. Maybe that's about the only thing that I think would change. And for 28, yeah, well, that's a bit further away, isn't it? And all bets are off for 28. I mean, is Lewis going to race in 28? Probably. But if he has a terrible I hope he doesn't, but if he has a terrible period between now and 28, he may not. And there might be a place at Ferrari, or there might be a switch then. George might go to Ferrari and Max might go to Mercedes. All sorts of things could happen then. But for 27, I don't think we're going to see any changes. Would you? I don't see Max leaving Red Bull for 27. Do you, Mark?
Not really, mainly because of, as you say, he would need a better option available, wouldn't he? And so that's what it comes down to. I think you'd have to say McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes are currently the teams that look like they could produce a better car than Ferrari, although that's questionable.
Than Red Bull.
Yeah, exactly. I suspect that Red Bull have suffered somewhat from the effort that they put in at the end of last year, when they very nearly pulled off a miracle and transformed their car to a championship winner. And maybe that's why they've started this year a little bit on the back foot. There have been times when they look like they're getting their act together, and then another time when it seems to drop off again. So a little bit dependent on the circuit. They are a very effective team. They have a huge amount of resources. So I suspect that in the short term, they're still his best option in terms of having a team devoted to him, which is important for him. I imagine that there are some games around salary being played at the moment, because there normally are, aren't there, with these guys? But I'd be pretty surprised if he left before, for 27. 28 is a much more open picture, because if they had another bad year, certainly if they had a bad start to next year with him driving the Red Bull, then I think that would be the thing that would change it. The other option was taking the sabbatical, wasn't it? But that's always a difficult thing, because you do lose your touch. There's no doubt that driving the cars regularly does make you quicker. And even for Max, that would be potentially challenging. It might come down to whether he thought there was anybody who could be a threat that might take his seat. And if he thought there wasn't, then he might be more willing to take that sabbatical than if he was concerned about someone coming up. So we shall see.
But let me ask you this, Mark. You're now Lawrence Stroll, right? You okay? You feeling okay? You're Lawrence Stroll, and you've just won 2 Grand Prix in the second half of 26. You're regularly making Q3. Fernando's won them both. Lance Stroll has got a podium finish. The car's brilliant now. Adrian Newey, Honda engines doing exactly what we expected. And in October, Max Verstappen rings you and says, I want to drive for you next year. I don't really care how much you pay me. I just want to drive your car, and I'll sign a 3-year contract. I want you for next year. What are you going to do?
Sign it.
And who would you replace? You're going to replace Fernando, right? Because you want your son to be racing and winning and doing all those wonderful things.
I'll pass on that one. I mean, no, obviously you'd want
So you'd replace Fernando with Max, even if Fernando's winning races.
I would replace Lance with Max first, but if I couldn't replace Lance with Max, then I'd replace Fernando with Max currently, just because of the future, thinking about the future more than anything. And to be honest, I think that might have been Max's plan I think the expectation was that Aston Martin would be better than they have been. And I do wonder if this has flown a bit of a fly in the ointment. The fact that they've been so poor has kind of taken away one of the options that he was probably thinking about. But it might still come to fruition, so we shall have to see, won't we?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a bit pie in the sky, isn't it? Because Aston Martin, to achieve that from where they are now would be, it's possible, of course, anything's possible. But it would mean a lot of other teams also going off the boil as well, probably, which I don't think is going to happen. But anyway, it was an interesting little scenario. Thank you very much indeed for that, Jim. Sarash again. Hi, Mark. First half of 2004, the car looked so difficult to drive. Kimi's onboard showed lots of oversteer and no grip. In the second half, the car became better. What happened?
Well, we changed the car. We had a new car. And then the so-called 19B was effectively a completely different car with much better aerodynamics. The 2004, the start of the car, the 19A it was effectively a lightly modified 18, the car that never raced. And it was awful. Aerodynamically, it was very inefficient. It was very, very
Why
bad.
was that? Where did you go wrong with the Aero?
I'm not sure. I mean, a different direction was taken from the 17 to the 18. It was supposed to be a more modern car because other teams' cars had seemed to develop more in a different direction to ours in 2002, 3, particularly the Ferrari, and the 18 was meant to reflect that, but it just didn't work. It was just poor, and I can only assume that mistakes were made in the wind tunnel. Maybe the wind tunnel wasn't performing correctly, but for whatever reason, aerodynamically, the 18A and the subsequent 19A, which was really an 18B, were disastrously poor when it came to aero performance, which isn't what you'd expect of an Adrian Newey designed car, but it was the case. And then there was some other, excuse me, poor decisions made. I think the 18, there was a lower crank on the engine to lower the engine, to lower the center of gravity, which was something that I think Adrian insisted on, but it ended up meaning that I believe there were lots of crankcase losses. So that basically the crank was churning around in the oil too much, the oil was getting too hot. So, there were cooling compromises that had to be made for that, as well as the extra friction from the engine because it was splashing, basically because the internals were splashing around in the oil more than they should have done. All these sorts of things. And then there was the twin shaft gearbox that was supposed to come in on the 18 and then into the 19, which was supposed to give faster shifts and would have done, but it was never reliable enough, and it was very heavy, so that never even made it to a race car. And then it was found that you could actually just have a conventional gearbox and time the shifts better, and you could achieve the same thing. So that was a lot of wasted money and development time. So yeah, it was just a whole array of things that were poorly done. And Adrian wanted a new car for the start of 19, but the team decided that they didn't have the resources to actually pull it off, which was a mistake. But when that 19B did hit the track, I think it was Manicourt in 2004, instantly we were just fast. And I think Kimi was second or third in Manicourt, and we put it on pole at Silverstone, and we won at Spa. And basically it came down mainly to just the aerodynamic performance of that version of the car was a huge improvement.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. Great insight. Sounds like an absolute shower in the first half, but amazing recovery in the second. Just shows what can be done. Just as an aside, could you have done that given today's budget cap regulations? Could you have made that change mid-season?
Quite possibly not.
And that bears out my theory that we're actually losing quite a lot in the sport now because of the budget cap, because we're not seeing that incredibly fast, brilliant turnaround that Formula One teams that they're capable of, and that's that's what we love. That's what I love to see, actually, to be honest.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that Aston Martin's performance, progress has been heavily restricted by the cost cap, and also, well, in fact, all the teams. So the cost cap does definitely help the team that comes out on top at the start of the year. Their advantage lasts longer than it would have done a few years ago, because the other teams just aren't allowed to catch up in the way that they would have done. And then the lack of testing also plays to that. So there's two factors there.
Yeah. And the main reason for cost cap, as far as we knew, was the midfield teams would all benefit because the money would be effectively more evenly spread and they would have more opportunity to develop a quick car. And look where Williams are today. The whole thing, absolutely as normal, as predicted. It's all about performance. It's all about people, and it's all about the market anyway sorts itself out in terms of what's affordable and what isn't, and the fans suffer as a result.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the quality of the people and the resources are what lead to the car that hits the track at the start of the year, and then if you have lots of money and you change some of the people, or those people that made mistakes understand the mistakes they made and correct those mistakes, then you can improve. But when you've got a cost cap, your ability to change people is reduced because better people might cost more money, and you can't spend the money on the development that you need to do to improve yourself. So it has that effect of sort of limiting things quite significantly. And yeah, but I mean, ultimately, it does mean that the team that spends the limited amount of money initially and does the best job, they get more reward for that. So it depends how you view that, doesn't it? From a fan's point of view, I think it is not a good thing. But you could also say that without a cost cap, you could just have one team with all the right people and they just dominate. And I guess to some extent we saw that with Mercedes 2014 on, because they hit the ground running and then were able to outspend other teams effectively for a long period of time. So yeah, it can work both ways.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. At any given stage of the history of the sport, Ferrari have always had a lot of money and a lot of resources. And so that's one constant. And then you've got the Mercedes coming and going, you've got the McLarens coming and going, you've got the Red Bulls, the Williams. And at any given stage, you've always got at least two, if not three teams capable of outspending one another, if that's the right phraseology. You see my point that, bearing in mind Ferrari don't win that much, bearing in mind they always have a lot of money, it's never going to be an issue. That it's never going to be one team dominating, because if you don't limit it, there's always the potential there for a Ferrari to come back and win races.
I mean, not wishing to be too hard on Ferrari necessarily, because it affects other teams as well, but they had a period of domination, sort of 2001 to 2004, because they were a well-run team in that period with focused development and great drivers, and it was all pulling in the right direction. But Ferrari, despite having a massive budget, there have been long periods when they haven't had that leadership or management. They haven't used that money effectively, and they've fallen away. So that you need both, and McLaren have suffered from that as well. They've had periods where they've had great people doing a great job and pulling together, and then periods when, despite having lots of money, they've then lost good people and had less good people, and it's all fallen apart again. And now they seem to be heading back in the other direction. So it's certainly true that money alone isn't enough, but if you're behind and you don't have the money, you're definitely not going to be able to recover, because even if you've got good people, they can't spend the money. So that's where that fundamentally, I'm agreeing with you in that sense, Peter, that the cost cap does stop teams recovering.
Yeah, to the benefit of the fans.
Yeah.
Right. Good discussion points there, Jim. Again, Mark, with the 26 cars, active aero and increased electrical power, which parameter is actually the limiting factor in determining the optimum lap time strategy? Aerodynamic drag, battery state of, just let me go to the next one, battery state of charge, electrical deployment, or the regulations governing when the aero modes can change? Still going to be electric, isn't it, or not? I don't know.
Well, the aero
answer there.
The aero stuff is fairly fixed, and I think the teams, the differences in performance in terms of the backing off of the aero, I think are probably going to be relatively small between one team and another. So I don't think the active aero is a huge player. It's going to be the recovery and deployment within the restrictions that the FIA impose that makes the biggest difference. And then in terms of ultimate car performance, it's the same things that we've had in the past. It's going to be aero efficiency around the parts of the track where the active aero isn't such a thing, and also aero characteristic. in tune with chassis mechanical characteristics. So the management of the balance through corner is absolutely crucial. You can have a car that's efficient at producing aero in a straight line, but if it doesn't do it in a way that is conducive to cornering, then you're not going to be as strong as a car that performs well. And this is where things like active aero come in, and the ability of the teams to manage the outwash from the front wing in terms of not disturbing the floor. All these things come into it and are absolutely critical. But that through corner management is really key, and it's something that became better understood over time. And as teams have improved their ability to measure aero performance on track, initially we just used to put cars in a wind tunnel, models of cars in wind tunnels, and develop them in a straight line. And then, in a long time ago, the wind tunnels didn't even have moving roads. So now they've got rolling roads. That was a big step forward. And then in the sort of, I think it was in the 90s, we started rotating the car in the tunnel. So even though the track's just rolling straight, you would go through a sequence of attack angles in plan view, and that had an influence on how aero was developed. And then the teams learned to measure ride heights on track, what the actual ride heights of the car were moving through on track, and then they would develop a range of ride height movement for the tunnel where you would optimize your aero. So there's no point optimizing the aero for ride height combinations that the car didn't actually see. So things like that have come on, and that's all still the case, and it is absolutely crucial. And what the teams did in the last sort of 10 years was develop myriads of floor pressure tappings to see what's actually happening on the floor, and then feed that back into the tunnel, and into CFD is obviously the other area that's come on massively. So it's not just what your aero efficiency and performance is at, say, 300 kilometers an hour that matters nowadays. It's across the range of speeds, it's across the range of ride heights, it's across the range of yaw angles. So that is absolutely crucial. And then building a mechanical package that allows you to control the ride heights in the most efficient area while still allowing basically the tires to stay on the track. So rising rate in heave and in roll is absolutely crucial. So it's very, very complicated, but all these things are still important to car development. But the one thing that isn't so important is that active aero, in terms of it's quite hard to generate big differences in performance level between the cars with the active aero. I mean, I think the so-called Macarena flip-flop rear wing is one area where that has been done, but I think that's quite unusual. I think ultimately there isn't much scope to make big differences between the car's performance in that area.
And given the issues we've had with that flip-flop wing, there's half a chance it's going to be banned anyway for 27, I would have thought.
I don't know. Possibly they'll regulate it such that the movement of that wing is restricted. But I would still say that any time you've got a moving wing element, you've still got a risk. So I'm not sure that the risk of it's just a badly designed flopping rear wing is going to be a problem. I guess the fact that it has to move further in a given amount of time, I suppose that must increase the likelihood that it won't be aerodynamically correct by the time it settles down, or it takes longer for that to happen. So maybe there is a reason to ban it. But just moving aero is just not a very good idea.
No, definitely not.
And is only there because of the lack of electrical recovery and energy available because of not having front axle recovery, MGU-H's, and expecting to get too much power from electrical. side of things,
which is where we came in the
which is
first
where we
place. I
came
mean,
in.
everything always goes back to that, doesn't it? At the end of the day,
Yeah,
with these regs,
yeah,
it's so frustrating.
yeah.
Thanks for that, Mark. AB Vespa, good name. Hey, Peter and Mark. What I still don't understand is why the performance of an F1 car this week is great, and the next week the driver complains that the performance is poor. How come? Well, there's a pretty, that's a question that sums up not only this era of Formula One, but many. I think it's not the first time we've had that at all. And just
Mm.
on that, I've been doing during the August break, I've been going through quite a lot of my files, as some of you know, and it's in the form of desk folders, but also I've got a massive, great box of real tapes, REWL tapes, which was given in Australia actually, and a lot of them are interviews with drivers from the 60s. So I've been digitizing those and putting them out. I'm starting to put them onto my podcast now. They're all audio, just so you can hear what Jack Brabham sounded like, what Denny Holmes sounded like, what John Miles sounded like, Jochen Rindt. And interestingly, listening to these, it's just the same then as now, which is,
Mm.
well, yeah, it's Jack Brabham talking about, well, the start of the year, the car was not very good at all, and we had a lot of problems with traction, and this wasn't very good. But the second half, I think we made a few tweaks to the rear wing, we got this working, and then all of a sudden the car was pretty drivable. And not much has changed, Mark, has it? Because it's never the same. Formula One is never ever the same from one day to the next, let alone one racetrack to the next.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. And going back to the sort of first question, it is the differences in the tracks that lead to that difference in performance. Because imagine that you have a car that produces an extraordinary amount of downforce efficiently at a particular ride height, better than another car. As long as you can hold it at that ride height, i.e. with very stiff suspension, you'll have a quicker car than one that doesn't have that aerodynamic performance, as long as the track is smooth. But as soon as you've got a bumpy track, then the car that produces more downforce across a wider range, even if its peak efficiency isn't quite as good as the other car, that car will then have an advantage because it can run softer and ride the bumps better. So the very peaky car starts to just basically, the tires aren't on the ground enough at the time, but the softer, slightly less efficient car, it actually becomes more efficient because over the ride height range that it moves around in use, it's actually developing more downforce in that time. So this is the point I was trying to get to about how Aero has developed in terms of the aerodynamicist understanding that peak downforce at a particular point on the track isn't what you need. You need an envelope of performance, and the wider that envelope is, the better the car will be. I mean, obviously, you can reach the point where you have a low level of downforce across a wide range of ride heights, and then your car won't be good because it never develops a high enough level of downforce, and the stiffer car will actually be quicker. So it's about finding the right compromise. And that's what the teams are working towards all the time. And that's why we've seen some sort of quite complicated suspension setups over the years. Teams trying to optimize their aerodynamic windows. And it depends which angle you're coming at it from. There used to be the case, to be honest, where the aero guys would basically present an aero package, and then the engineers would spend the rest of the year trying to optimize the suspension to fit in that. And I do think that the teams that produce the best cars are the ones that have realized that you need to do those two things together. So you need to approach the season where the aero and the suspension guys are working together to produce the best compromise from the start. And I think that's what Mercedes and Red Bull and latterly McLaren have done better than Ferrari, for instance. Certainly, as working at Haas, what was very obvious in 2023 was that because all the teams have to develop their own aero. So whilst Haas are able to buy suspension, gearbox, engine, braking, uprights, wishbones from Ferrari, what they can't do is buy the wings and the bodywork and the floor from Ferrari, so they do have to develop their own aero. And it was very obvious that the mechanical components we bought from Ferrari were not in tune with our aero. And so we had to run our car stiffer because of the limitations of the components we bought than we actually wanted to. Our aero was a much flatter profile, we suspected, than the Ferrari. So the Ferrari at low ride heights would generate much more downforce than we could, and that's why their suspension went very stiff. But we didn't get that benefit, so we still had to run the suspension stiff because those were the bits we had, but it meant that our car bounced around a lot in those regions and killed our tires. And the next year in 24, the Ferrari parts were more conducive to our car. We developed our car better. We gained more downforce at lower ride heights, but also Ferrari had obviously conned onto the fact that maybe they could do a better job by having softer suspension in some areas. And all of a sudden we were able to run a car softer in the areas that we needed to, and we got better performance and better tire life. But the problem for a team like Haas is they're not in the position of combining those two, because they don't have authority over the whole design area. And that's one of the disadvantages they've got.
Mark, let me ask you this, a little bit based on what you've just been talking about. It's to do with differing performances of the car, different performing levels. Who's the best driver you ever worked with who could put on a set of soft tires for qualifying that you hadn't run at that point, who had an immediate feel for how much grip was in those tires and how to maximize that grip? You see where I'm coming from?
I do, and I would say it was different drivers at different times. Mick could certainly do that at certain times, but then there were times when if the car wasn't working the way he wanted, he couldn't extract the performance. Similarly, Kimi. I would say Kimi was maybe a bit less adaptable than Mick, but then there were other times when, for instance, when it rained, you could put Kimi out on the track and he would perform a fantastic lap. Fernando, phenomenal ability most of the time to do that.
And
so
if I can just stop you there,
yeah.
do they feel that grip level on the out lap, on the preparation lap?
Yeah.
Do you think they know exactly where they're going to brake for the first corner by the time they've done the preparation?
Yeah, they know straight away. That's, and I must admit, I never understood how they understood, but they did. I suspect that Michael in his prime was particularly good at that. I mean, I think I've mentioned it before. There was a wet session at Spa, I think in 2000. I can't quite remember which year it was, and we'd had a dry P1 and then it rained over the break before P2, and it was quite heavily wet at the start of P2, and we waited a while and no one went out, and then Michael went out, and his first lap, I think it stood for about 15 minutes. Other people, after he'd gone out, other people started going out, but his first lap stood as the fastest lap for a long time. And it wasn't because the conditions got worse or anything like that. It was simply that his ability at that point in his career was he was able to nail it instantly. And I don't remember anyone else ever saying anything about it or noticing, but I remember just staring at the screen and thinking that was possibly the greatest single lap I'd ever seen because it was so outstanding that he'd just gone out and nailed it. And it never counted for anything because I think the track then dried, and by the end of the session, it was a totally different story. But I just, that was the single most impressive lap I think I saw from anyone, apart from maybe Mika's qualifying laps at Monaco in 94 and in 99. Yeah, but then Kimi's qualifying lap at Monza in 2005 was phenomenal. Yeah, it's difficult to say, but I think they all have it at different times. I think possibly now you would have to say Max and Kimi are the ones that seem to be able to really turn it on. Yeah. it's difficult to say. But generally, I think all the top drivers have that ability, and it is what differentiates them from, shall we say, the just very good drivers.
James Hunt, who I mentioned, third time mentioning now, that at the beginning of the show, you can see that glimpse of him winning at Zandvoort, was one of the best qualifying tyre drivers I ever saw. And I remember, as if it was yesterday, chatting to him in the paddock at Austria 75 when he was driving for Hesketh, and talking to him about, we're talking about at that stage, there was a big tyre war going on in trying to make the tires as light as possible. It was very dangerous, and very sadly, we lost Mark Donoghue the next day. 2-ply tires were lighter than 4-ply, and Firestone and Goodyear were already going at it. And James is on Firestones. And I remember him saying, "Oh yes, I've actually discovered now the secret of how to do the qualifying lap. I know how to do the qualifying lap now." I remember him saying it as if he was saying it to me today, right now. And I said, "Well, what is it, James?" I think I said something like that. And he said, "I'll tell you after qualifying." And when I went to see him, he just said it was all to do with the preparation and the mindset that he had and the feel that he wanted to get from the car on the outlap. And he had never really focused on that before. And it was just always just a question of driving and then bolting on the soft tires and going out. And it could be, you know, at that point, maybe he was the first driver ever to realize the importance of the preparation lap.
It's quite possible. I suspect that Jackie Stewart probably had good feeling that he probably didn't discuss with people, because I think he was one of the first properly thinking drivers.
Yeah, but I think I don't think in Jackie's case we had qualifying tires per se every race just coming out in the way that we did in the later 70s. Jackie, definitely, I totally agree with everything you've said there. And obviously all the great drivers, Jim Clark, Tazio Nuvolari, probably, for sure, but a new set. But give me the new set on my Alfa Romeo. I need it now, you know. No, but this was in an era when they had 5, 6, 7 sets of qualifying tires, you know, and everybody just expected you to find a second a lap. And some drivers didn't, you know, Jochen Mass in the other McLaren wouldn't necessarily find a second, but James always would. And I think that it just clicked for him in Austria 75.
It's interesting you mentioned James Hunt, because I think he's, again, an underrated driver. I certainly, when people I talked to at McLaren when I was there who had worked with him, and there were a few, they did say that he was unbelievably quick on a single lap. And I think probably quite similar to Mika in terms of his approach to racing. And I found that quite fascinating, because whilst he was obviously a quick driver and able to win the championship, I hadn't appreciated just how good he actually was.
Yeah.
And certainly that peak time of sort of 75, 76, 77. You know, I
well,
think
we'll think about this, Mark. 75, he's driving for Hesketh, and Emerson's he's won the World Championship with McLaren in 74. 75 didn't go quite as well. Back end of the year, when all the deals have been done, Emerson decides that he's going to leave McLaren and go to, with his brother Wilson, do this completely new Formula One team called Copersucar, the Brazilian team. And you do that. Suddenly McLaren don't have a driver. Jackie Ickx isn't available. He's on a Marlboro contract. So they sign James Hunt. And he's never sat in the car. He hasn't done anything at all. He goes to Brazil, to Interlagos, and puts the car on the pole.
Amazing.
Yeah. You know, that was, we got to remember that about James, how good he was and how quick he was.
Yeah.
And Zandvoort, in some ways, you know, brings that to mind, because he obviously won there in the Hesketh as well. You know, it's a great circuit for him. Yeah. Great times, great discussions. Thanks everybody for being a part of this. It's really good. We've gone down some great avenues of Formula One history, as well as the present, obviously. Ronnie, another of our regulars. Hi there, Ronnie. Hi, Peter and Mark. Love the folders of Formula One Pass. Thank you very much. Schedoni leather. Yeah, I mean, that leather on that folder is, I guess, the leather that's what it would have felt like when they used that Schedoni leather on the Ferrari Formula One seats, which were always beautiful. Absolutely. The cockpit of the Formula One Ferraris in the 60s and 70s was just wonderful. With the spring format, how much Friday's single practice session, a sprint format, I think you mean, getting a bit confused here with the autumn break and, the August break and the spring format. The sprint format, how much Friday's single practice session would you sacrifice for qualifying performance versus race setup for this circuit? So the question is, what are they going into, I think, with this? Are they, with practice, are they going into qualifying, or are they thinking of the race already, or what?
You're trying to do the best of both. And you basically you don't have enough laps or tyres to do either job properly. So what tended to happen is, and the other thing about first practice is the track is normally in a really poor state.
Especially Zandvoort with
Well,
the
yeah,
sand and everything.
yeah, but to be fair, that it's surprising how bad most of them are. But yeah, Zandvoort and it used to be Hungary, used to be the other one that was really, really bad, although that got a lot better in recent years. So you have to be realistic, and you'd go out on your first set of tyres and you're basically just checking that the car works and that the driver is reasonably happy with the balance, accepting that the grip will be low, and you're not going to learn that much. You can then choose to do another run on that same set of tyres, and now those tyres have gone off quite a bit. So you're probably not going to learn that much more, but the track grip will have improved quite significantly. So the lap time might be kind of surprisingly decent, or even better than the first lap on the new tyres. But you have to take into account the comments. You have to take them with a pinch of salt, because everything is evolving. You then have to decide whether you're going to, or you could decide to rerun those same tyres with heavy fuel, just so that you got some idea of ride heights, because realistically, in terms of the balance, you're not going to get a great read, because of the state of the tyres and the state of the track. And then right at the end of the session, you might put your second set of tyres on, which will probably be a different compound. You'll have to decide which compound you're going to run and do a quali lap. And that's the best the track's going to be, and it's going to be reasonably close to sprint quali first run. And that's it, and you're out of time. And so you often used to walk away thinking, well, how much did we actually learn? Well, we learned that the car either worked or didn't work in terms of function, and we just have to make some appropriate guesses. But this is where the driver's strength of mind really comes into it, and the driver's experience, because drivers that don't understand the changes in grip will start getting carried away with setup changes unnecessarily, and drivers that can't adapt won't be able to make the jump for the next session. So it really does sort the men from the boys, I would say. Or probably not the right thing to say these days. Sorry, but it does show who's got the experience, who's got the ability. And to be fair, at Formula One level, most of them are pretty good. But even so, it was still quite noticeable that some could cope with those sort of situations better than others. But it's tricky. And to be fair, the teams come out of first practice at a sprint weekend without a great understanding of where they are and without a huge amount of time to do much about it. The main thing they'll be doing is sorting out their ride heights, to try and optimize them, bearing with taking skid wear into account. That is normally the main focus, and then the other focus will simply be on looking at what the other drivers are doing in terms of lines and approaches to energy management, I would imagine, and trying to draw some conclusions on that before sending the car out on the track for quali.
Yeah, a bit sad you have to talk about the whole energy management thing again. I was getting quite excited then about lines and stuff, but then the dreaded energy management reared its ugly head again. Aaron says, Peter, if you were in charge of setting up driving as an Olympic sport, what events would you set up and vehicles would you use? That's an interesting question. I was having this chat to somebody the other day about golf being in the Olympics. I'm not a fan, to be honest, but anyway, that's just me. Olympic sport driving. Very difficult, isn't it? Because the problem is you've got so many mechanical variables. If you want to compare one human being with another, and everything has to be identical, and it never will be. Even if you have all in the same cars, they're all going to be different. Tires are going to be different. Everything's going to be slightly different one from another. So even if you had a sort of race of champions as we know it today format, it still wouldn't really produce the best driver, I don't think. So what would I do? I'm not sure what I'd do. I'm not sure I would put it in the Olympics. I think I'd go for Bernie's thing. Bernie, one of the last years that he was running Formula One, invited me to his motorhome for at about 11 o'clock it was on a Friday, and I waited outside. I came in. He said, "Bring your cameraman with you." So I brought Jimbo with me, and we went up into the top. And he said, "Now ask me about the new Formula One race that's going to happen in Athens." And I said, "Okay, tell me, Bernie, about this Formula One race in Athens, where the Olympics started." And he said, "Oh, yeah, it's where we need to have a Formula One. I can't wait to see it. The cars coming into the stadium, the whole thing, the Olympics, the rings." This interview went on for about 10 minutes. And I said, "What was that all about?" And he said, "Oh, I'm just going to use it to wind up somebody else. Don't worry." And I'm thinking, well, maybe that's what Formula One should do. We should somehow, I don't think we should have driving or Formula One as an Olympic sport, but maybe somehow we should hold a Grand Prix or something over the Olympic weekend just to annoy all the Olympians and distract from what they're doing. But no, I don't know. Have you got any thoughts on that one, Mark?
I think it's impossible to do it effectively. If the Race of Champions format is entertaining and is probably as good a thing as you can do, isn't it? Because rallying, karting, circuit racing, they're all so different. And as you say, it depends so much on the equipment. I just don't think it's appropriate as an Olympic sport, honestly.
No, I don't either. I think, yeah, as I said, for me, even making something like golf doesn't really work, or cricket, or I'm not sure cricket is in the Olympics, but I just don't see how that would work myself. Anyway, thanks for the question. It's an interesting one. Get our brains working. Reminding me of that interview with Bernie about the Olympic. It's going to be called the Olympic Grand Prix in Athens. Hi, this is JPS 78 MA. Peter, you've described sun drivers as spiky. What do you mean by spiky? I mean the edge of the readout, the telemetry readout I mean, this is being very, very basic, but instead of being a slight curve, it's a point, it's a spiky point. And that's the difference, in my opinion, between, and I'll say Kimi Raikkonen here to bring Mark into the conversation, to say between Kimi Raikkonen and some other drivers that he would have worked with probably over the years who wouldn't have been and aren't as rounded in their inputs as Kimi. And I'm not saying that those necessarily are actually visible on telemetry. If it's a massive difference, it would be. But if you're talking a very small difference, maybe it's not even measurable. But that's what we mean by spiky. And the less spikes, bumps you have, the better for the car, for you, for the tires, for your inputs, for your outputs, for everything. Does that kind of make sense, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. Largely because, and it mostly comes down to the tyres, I think, as well as transient load changes as well. But ultimately, it comes down to the tyres. It's all about the contact patch, isn't it? And it's that thing about the sensitivity of the contact patch and not disturbing it too much. So you want the car to change direction. You have to get the most out of that contact patch. And if you apply a violent movement to it, then the car doesn't want to change direction quickly, or it'll react badly. But there are times when, particularly if you've got, say, a tyre that is too hard and is not, if you don't load it up enough, it just doesn't generate enough grip because it doesn't generate enough temperature. Sometimes those spiky inputs can help
Or give temperature, yeah.
to bring the grip up, but it's not really that. That's more because of the situation. If you had the right tyre on the right track, that was working at the right temperature, the smoother inputs are always going to be the ones that are better. So it's really only adverse circumstances that allow a more aggressive driver, shall we say, to be faster.
Just on that point, Mark, am I correct in remembering that when Kimi was on a formation lap and you wanted to get temperature in the front tires, he was even more aggressive than most in the way he could do that? He really leant on the front. Am I right in thinking that?
To some extent, but he would mainly work the brakes.
Okay, which we couldn't
so
see,
he
of
would do
course.
quite a lot of brake throttle overlap to get the brake temperature up and then that brake temperature would then get into the tires. And it's quite an art, because obviously if you overdo that, you're going to fry your brakes. And but he was very good at managing his track input, but particularly his brake temperature input into the tires. And in fact, when we sort of went towards cars where the brake temperature was almost completely isolated from the tire, he sometimes had problems because he wasn't able to manipulate the brake temperature to get the tire temperature that he wanted. So that could be problematical. And we actually, this was at Renault, or Lotus as it was then, we ended up actually having to sort of open up those brake ducts to allow more hot air onto the tire to get the temperature that we needed.
But why was there a moment when the brake temperatures were isolated from the tire temperature? Was that a regulatory thing that happened?
No.
I can't remember.
Essentially, because originally there was just too much temperature.
Oh, okay.
So the tires were overheating.
Right.
So development went down the path of isolating the tires from, and the wheel rims mainly, from that temperature. But we actually got to the point where we'd gone too far, and we hadn't realized that we needed to sort of manage it from one event to another, depending on the circuit, depending on the tires that we had. So it was one of those learning things, really. And it's something that the teams are still have to manage today, to some extent. And it's why the FIA introduced, you couldn't adjust the brake ducts during the race, for instance. I know there was a time when it seemed, shall we say, that McLaren were adjusting their brake ducts in pit stops to change the amount of cooling flow to the wheel rims. And there was talk when I left McLaren of sort of active brake ducts to manage this. So that was part of it. But
what's
I would say
an active brake duct when it's at home?
So varying the inlet geometry to change the amount of airflow coming into the brake duct.
What, in real time?
Over a period of time. So not corner by corner, but sort of during the course of laps, over a number of laps. So that you would start off with sort of temperature to get the tires going, and then have cooler flowing, cool the tires down as the pressure and temperatures built up, so that they didn't get too hot.
What, cockpit adjustable?
No, sort of basically bimetallic strips to adjust the inlet aperture size on the. So it was purely a passive system. So it wasn't active. It couldn't be controlled, other than it would change over time. Yeah.
But doesn't that come under the heading almost of a movable aerodynamic device?
Oh, no, surely not.
Right. Okay. Moving swiftly on. Right. Sorry, let's get back to my page here. So I just want to make sure that I don't lose this thing. Stefan Jakimovic, what did the driver and engineer disagree? Hello. What do the driver and the engineers disagree about the most? Short corners or something else? I'm sure it's not short corners, because they haven't got time to get around to that. It's probably more about setup stuff, I would imagine. But talk through some of your memorable disagreements with drivers, Mark, if you can think of any. Probably not, knowing you. You're such a pleasant chap.
There've been a few over time. Gear ratios used to be a big one back in the days when we used to change gear ratios. Yeah, it would be particularly with Mick, because basically he would be pushing for something that was impossible to fit to the car, and I would spend my time pointing out that we didn't have an infinite number of gear ratios in the car. So if he wanted the fourth gear to be right for turn 5 at Monaco, it couldn't also be correct for turn 11 or whatever.
Yeah.
So we spent an awful lot of time debating that. What else? I mean, probably wing level. Whether to be running a higher downforce level or a lower downforce level in the old days. Now even that's not a possibility, except when they introduced some different wings at Spa, wasn't it? So downforce level used to be an old bone of contention that we used to sort of disagree a bit about. It's everything really, because it all comes down to a compromise. So, a driver might fixate on one corner where something would help him, but you would then point out that would have a disadvantage at other places, and then the driver would get frustrated because it's not perfect, and you'd be apologetic on the basis that unfortunately that's just life. And we have to come to the best compromise, and ultimately we'd come to an agreement on something, but it would almost inevitably result in the driver being unhappy about something.
Mark, just on those compromises though, how much was top speed and what your estimated top speed was, or reality by the time you'd run the car against others, compared with other teams, and wanting to have maybe a 3 mile, 4 mile an hour advantage over the opposition, compared with, say, ride heights? Which was the more defining starting point in terms of setup for a car at a circuit?
Yeah, I think we would, the correct end of straight speed was normally fairly easily achieved, because most of the time you're actually thinking, I want to run as much downforce as I can whilst being competitive. So you would look at what other speeds cars are doing, and you would rarely want to be the fastest car down the straight, because frankly that's not normally where lap time is. You would normally be saying, well, I want to be competitive on the straight, but I'd like to run a bit more downforce. So you kind of work in those parameters. It depends obviously on your engine performance. Sometimes you knew you had a stronger engine than other people. Sometimes you had a weaker engine. So when you have a weak engine, so let's say, for instance, the Renault hybrid in 14, you would have to run a lower downforce level than you ideally would, knowing that it would be less than the other teams are running, and you would still be slower on the straight because your engine wasn't as good. And then I would say, to some extent, with the Ferrari engine, when I was at Haas, you knew that you were going to be pretty strong on wing in qualifying. So you would actually be looking at the speeds and going, I know that I can probably afford to be a little bit slower in practice, because I'll probably pick up a bit of pace in qualifying. So sometimes the driver would be like, well, we're too slow on the straight in practice, and you'd be like, well, I'm pretty sure we're going to be competitive when it comes to qualifying, so I don't think we should reduce downforce. Sometimes you'd have those sorts of discussions, whereas ride height is much more it's defined by the practicalities of bottoming on the track, and then it comes down to more to spring rate. So you might have more of a discussion about spring rate, because the ride height you run is defined on is a question of the spring rate and the load. So it'd be more about whether the driver was uncomfortable with the ride over a curb or under braking over some bumps. He might want to go softer, and you'd have to point out that if you did that, then you'd have to raise the ride heights, and then you'd lose some downforce at a low speed apex. And is that what he really wanted? And if he said yes, then fine. But if he didn't, then he would change his mind. And sometimes it'd go the other way. They'd want to be stiffer. They'd be thinking that the other driver's running a lower ride height than me. Is that because I'm running softer suspension? And if it is, I want to go stiffer. And then you'd say, are you sure? Because there's this bump that we also have to worry about. And if you're stiffer there, the car will be upset by that bump or that curb, and that might be a disadvantage, a greater disadvantage. So those are the sorts of discussions you'd end up having.
But in terms of not really having time or scope to talk about driving style, I don't suppose, I mean, how would Kimi Raikkonen have reacted when you said to him, as inevitably you did at Monaco in any given year, Kimi, have you noticed that you are turning in much earlier into Rascasse, whereas Juan Pablo's going in much wider and getting on the power maybe a little bit sooner. He's got a bit more oversteer on exit. Why don't you give Juan Pablo's style a try? How would Kimi have reacted to that?
He would basically have blanked me or appeared offended. And then he would have gone away and actually had a look at it in his room, and then he would probably try it on the track and not tell me whether it was better or worse.
Very good. Very good.
He was brilliant at that, because that's important though. He would listen, and even if he didn't instantly just agree with you, he would give it some thought and he would probably try it out, unless he knew that there was a reason why he was doing something differently and that there was a consequence that I wasn't aware of. And that was sometimes true. So, you know, he was very smart at that. And I would say, of all the drivers I work with, the easiest to manage in that respect, because you knew you would say something and just give him food for thought, and it was up to him whether he paid attention to it or not. And I was happy with that, because I would say 99 out of 100 he would make the right choice. Whether there are other drivers who you just spend ages and ages and ages trying to persuade them that what they're doing isn't the right thing, and they just don't seem to want to listen or don't seem to be capable of making the change that's necessary. And that's when it got really frustrating.
Go and give us an example.
Yeah, let's. I don't want to be rude, but a French driver I ran at Renault, Esteban Ocon, was uncoachable. You couldn't have those discussions with him. Just wasn't interested. He always knew better than you. It was quite hard. And the thing is that the guy is talented, absolutely, no question he's talented, but incredibly defensive, but didn't have just wasn't willing to have the discussions, or always had another reason why that wouldn't work or something. It was just really, really tough to work with. And okay, it may be that another engineer was able to work with him better and had a more successful relationship, which is fine. You know, that does happen. Sometimes you click with people and sometimes you don't.
Do you think that tendency was exacerbated by winning in Hungary, and that changed his mindset, that he knew?
Well, he won that race after I was with him, so it's difficult for me to say, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay. Right, let's move on. Mirren DD9. Mark, can you talk about heat and the race at Qatar in 23?
It was very hot. It was also very windy. But I was working with Kevin, and to be honest, Kevin's one of the toughest characters, I would say, on the grid. So for him, it wasn't actually too much of a problem. It didn't affect us in terms of his performance in the way that I think some other drivers were affected. The car wasn't very good because, as I mentioned earlier, we had problems with significant tyre drop-off, mainly because we were having to run the car very stiff because the Ferrari suspension didn't have much travel. And you had to run it stiff just to avoid hitting bump stops, which was disappointing. So we just didn't have a very good car.
Mark, can I suggest that, given his a very harmonious driver in terms of his rates of input and the way he drove, that Kevin actually would probably be doing pretty well in these current cars?
He possibly, he wasn't very good at, to be honest, at dealing with understeer. And this was a bit of his downfall, really, in that the current generation of cars do have quite a lot of mid-corner understeer. And it didn't really fit in with his driving style, and he wasn't able to, sadly, he wasn't able to work his way around it. So I'm not sure. It's difficult to say. I would have liked to have seen him drive these cars, because they're different than the previous generation, and I don't think the previous generation really suited him. But I'm not 100% sure. Okay. I just worry slightly that understeer characteristic that I think they still have wouldn't help him. But on the other hand, having a car with more grip than power, which is definitely a difference that they have now, might have enabled him to use his natural reflexes, which are phenomenal. It's actually, it's a shame that I feel ashamed that I wasn't able to work with Kev on a better car. I think he was never able to drive a car which I think suited him or showed him his capability. I do think he's one of the most naturally fast drivers I've worked with. but circumstances kind of got in the way of allowing him to show that capability.
Yeah.
I think he'd have made a great rally driver in some ways, potentially. Yeah, and I was really pleased to see him win that endurance race, because I think he's a better driver than his results have given, shown.
Yeah, he was unbelievably quick, wasn't he, when he first came in as well?
Yeah,
With
yeah.
McLaren, really, really good. Haven't got too much time left, as Cameron would say, as we round third base. Right. Another question about Kev. Mark, can you talk about Kev's BB balance and engine braking for his starts? He talks about it in his book.
Oh, I didn't know Kev had a book.
No. Must read
So,
that. Wonder if you're
yeah.
mentioned.
Probably not. To be honest, I don't remember too much about that. I mean, we used to, from what I recall, it was a question of he would change the brake balance to warm up the tyres in a particular way on the formation lap, and then make sure he adjusted it back for the race start. And sometimes he used to ask for a reminder. Normally not, to be honest. He was pretty self-contained. In fact, I think sometimes just saying, he would ask me to say last driver is on the grid, just to give him time to make sure he'd made all the changes, which is fairly common now. But honestly, his ability to manage throttle clutch against the slip was something I didn't see from any other driver. He did have his feel for that was truly astonishing, and led to many good starts. It was absolutely one of his strengths, the start. Yeah, he also had clever techniques to do with the way he dropped the clutch, which I won't go into. But
why not?
Just because I think it's something he might still be using potentially, and I don't. And that's his thing. It was something he did that was his thing. So that's not fair.
Fair enough.
But he's street smart as a driver. In some ways, he has a similarity with Kimi in that way, and I would say with Fernando. These are street-wise, street-fighting drivers who have a very sharp, canny mindset.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed that. I thought that was good. Yeah.
I'd include Nigel Mansell in that.
I'm sure. Do you know Nigel Mansell? Is he not? Could be the fastest driver of all time, given his weight and the fact that weight wasn't taken into account. He was, what was he? Must have been a good 10, 15 kilos heavier than Alain Prost, maybe 20.
Yeah.
And that is a lot of lap time. When we're talking typically 0.3 per 10 kilos. So factor that into every race that Nigel Mansell ever did. Absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah. Right. Just a couple more questions because time has crept up on us, as we say. Max Flashart has got a message saying Hajar has injured his wrist. Liam Lawson is stepping in and Yuki in for Liam. So that'll be interesting to see Liam back in the A team again, won't it? He's been driving very well recently and he's found a really good groove. So around Zandvoort, he'll probably go pretty well. I think he had a shunt, didn't he, on that back corner at Zandvoort at one point, but he's a different driver now and I think he'll probably go very well. Thoughts on that one, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, he went very well in the Toro, what was it called? Alpha Tauri, or whatever it was called then, when he stood in for Danny Ricciardo, was it?
Yeah.
I think the thing is, he knows it's only for one race, doesn't he? So it'll be a very different mindset than if he was going in for a full race weekend. I hope he frees off his mind and allows himself to drive more freely than maybe he did when he was under a lot of pressure starting his career at Red Bull, which only lasted 2 races. So we'll see. It's going to be tough for him to do that, to show well on a one-off race. But then he has been driving up until now. It's just whether that car, again, might have the same issue I was talking about between Haas and Ferrari. Is the Aero characteristic, or the way the Aero performs around the corners, around the lap of the Racing Bull, is that different to the Red Bull? And so how difficult will it be for him to adapt to that? And the brakes is the other big thing that the drivers, switching from one car's braking system to another. I don't know how similar they are, and that could be a make or break thing for him. But I really hope he shows that he makes the most of the opportunity, because I don't think what happened to him last time around was really fair. But at the end of the day, these guys, they're going for the top job, aren't they? And you have to be good enough. So
and I think it's quite interesting and impressive that Red Bull are doing that rather than putting Ivan Lindblad in the car, because we've all been saying in theory that it's going to be Soloff and Lindblad next year, and Liam might be in trouble. But here they are giving a real opportunity now to change that, and that, I don't know, speaks well of Red Bull's driver program. I think that they are doing that, and we wish Liam all the best for that. Obviously,
it is different people now, isn't it, at Red Bull? So maybe that will also be in Liam's favour, and there's a sort of breath of fresh air blowing through there.
Yeah. Right. Just trying to some other one. Here's one. JPS 78 Mario Andretti MA. Did you ever spend any time with Innes Ireland? Never saw him race, but I enjoyed his writing. He wrote a wonderful article chronicling the Ferrari he bought at the factory and drove home to the UK. Yeah, I did actually know Innes pretty well, because, well, only once he'd retired, obviously. He was sports editor of Autocar before Ray Hutton, and I took over from Ray Hutton. So Innes had retired from journalism at that point. Well, he hadn't. He actually still writing for Road and Track from memory. So anyway, I knew him as a journalist. As well, I was a journalist, and there was Innes Ireland, and I was always in awe of Innes. And he was very cool, smooth customer. Spoke the Queen's English. Always dressed kind of in a tweed jacket with a cravat, that sort of look, soft cap, and was wildly wise. He was very, very good. And we used to sit down and have lots of chats about the days, the great days. There was always a slightly bitter, I always felt there was a slightly bitter chip on the shoulder feel to Innes, because of the way his career had gone, and being sacked by Lotus after winning the 61 US Grand Prix at Watkins Glen, because Chapman thought the future was Jim Clark and not Innes Ireland, was a blow from which he never really recovered. He did have some great races. He won non-championship races after that, notably for BRP, but it was a huge kick in the solar plexus for Innes, that. And I think that stayed with him the rest of his life, to be honest. But he did some brilliant stuff as a journalist, drove the Lotus 56 turbine car for Autocar, for example. And was, he was very, very fast racing driver. And and obviously he and Jimmy never really got on, I don't think. But I was at his funeral in London, and sad day, very sad day. But yeah, he's very good writer, very good writer. So yeah, I'm going to have to draw a line there, everybody. And first of all, I just want to thank Mark for his input, and how amazing it is to go down all these different storylines, Mark, from questions that come from our viewers. And thank you so much for your time, and for your experience, and for your knowledge, and for everything you brought to the show. It's absolutely fabulous. And
No
we look
problem at
forward
all.
to many more like this in the future. You will come back, I hope. Right. And just moving on from that, I talked a little bit about merchandise, and we do have some new products out. We have a Make Engines Great Again t-shirt, and we also have one, it's a fairly subliminal thing, but it's just a picture I love of Jim Clark, and it's a Jim Clark t-shirt, and that's the barcode. If you want to have a look there, I'll keep it up for a few seconds, and maybe you want to freeze frame it. Also, that is the one, this is the barcode for Make Engines Great Again, the other new t-shirt on our Bonfire platform, which is brilliant. Thank you very much again for that. And finally, as I mentioned, we are uploading a lot of audio onto our audio channel, which finds its way into YouTube as an audio as well, which you can listen to as a YouTube video. And the latest, we've done a lot in the last couple of days. Neil Allen in Australia is one we've just put up. Great Australian driver who very quiet, came from nowhere really, and started just winning races blisteringly fast. And I spoke to Neil in Australia about 3 years before he sadly passed away, but that interview's there now on our podcast channel. And I've also got one I did with Niki Lauda, and which Niki basically talks about his career in quite long detail. It's about a 23-minute audio chat with Niki. A little bit of background clatter going on. I recorded it at a test session, but anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. That is the podcast for Niki Lauda. If you want to take a look at that QR code as well. So again, many thanks to everybody for being a part of this, and we hope to do another live stream next week after the Dutch Grand Prix. We will do another live stream. And just to reiterate, for members, we will be doing the live race chat on Sunday, starting about half an hour before the race from Zandvoort, or around Zandvoort. And if we haven't got the back part of our channel fully up to speed at that point, the AdSense side, I will be posting the link that will enable you to get into that show and ask your questions and be a part of it in the normal way. So don't worry about that. That'll be put out on the community section of our channel, and something always to watch as well. And I might try and post it on Blue Sky, which is the favored social media platform that we're now looking at as well. So many thanks to everybody for being a part of this. See you very soon. And for members, see you on race day from Zandvoort. Take care.